Welcome back. We are speaking with Gordon Chang. We're discussing with him the latest conversations that have been taking place between the United States and China. And I think we agree that what the takeaway by the Chinese from those conversations has been an emboldening of China, not a diminution of their appetite for some kind of military operation against Taiwan and perhaps beyond. Gordon, one of the questions that I was just asking you to contemplate is if the Chinese are spoiling for war, and I think you're right, it's pretty clear they are. Do you think that that extends to a determination to invade Taiwan no matter what? Or do you think that what they will try to do is to win without fighting, as Sun Tzu says, and secure through a military operation, yes, but a blockade rather than a physical attack on the island, the end state that they seek there?
Everything is on the menu, Frank, but there are many different ways that this struggle could play out. So, for instance, some of the islands of Taiwan are no more than 5 or 6 miles from the Chinese coast.
Mhm.
And so there is increasing talk about how Beijing would just grab one or two of those, or islands in the middle of the Taiwan Strait, which are strategically important. So any of those options are there. An embargo is also possible. The thing about an embargo, though, is that in order to be effective, the embargo has to cover an area that would include sovereign Japanese territory, especially the island of Yonaguni, which is basically on a clear day, you can see the island of Taiwan from Yonaguni, which is actually south of Taipei, 58 nautical miles from the main Taiwan island.
Mm.
So that would have to be inside of China's embargo. That would bring Japan into the fight. So there's always that as well. Any number of things can happen, Frank, and it's not so much just a conscious decision for China to invade Taiwan. It's also these intercepts that China is causing.
Mm.
The one on May 26th, where they got very close to a Royal Australian Air Force P-8A Poseidon, a reconnaissance craft, fired flares and chaff. Some of that was ingested into one of the two engines of the P-8,
Really?
which could have brought that plane down. So
Mm.
China, you can see from what it's doing, could start a war, quote unquote, accidentally. But
Mhm.
it's not just the intercepts of the Australians, it's also the intercepts of American craft as well, both aircraft and vessels. So this is exceedingly dangerous because we know that the law of averages says one of these will become a fatal incident.
A flashpoint for sure. Gordon, speaking of the Taiwan Strait, the Chinese announced recently that they were going to consider that to be an internal waterway of China, and that they were going to henceforth require those seeking to transit it or otherwise use such waters or airspace to get their permission for doing so. This is very similar to, of course, what they've previously said about the South China Sea. And I suspect there will be other parts of the Western Pacific that they will be similarly staking claims to in the days to come. Um, Give us your readout on where we stand with this regard, and does that ratchet up further, as you see it, the likelihood of a well conflict, perhaps, or miscalculation at the very minimum?
Yeah. The real test here will be whether the U.S. Navy continues its transits through the Taiwan Strait. Under the Biden administration, freedom of navigation operations have increased. And I think that's not only because the Biden team is worried, but it's also because China's been more provocative. And clearly, these most recent statements that the Taiwan Strait is internal Chinese water, blue national soil, indicates that we'll have to see what the Biden administration will do. But it's clear to me that what we need to do is to have increased transits and transits by carrier strike groups,
Yeah.
because that needs to make the message to China that this still is international water and that we defend freedom of navigation. But we have not seen a freedom of navigation operation since those Chinese statements of 3 or 4 days ago.
Yeah, we'll be watching this closely, as obviously will the Chinese. Unfortunately, again, probably further emboldened if they are not forthcoming. Gordon, let me ask you about a report out of Stockholm, the so-called Stockholm International Peace Institute. SIPRI has uh, done a report indicating that the Chinese are building up their nuclear capabilities. I think they're understating, frankly, the magnitude of that buildup, but it takes note of what is a important strategic development, it seems to me. Um, what's your reading on the magnitude of what the Chinese are doing with their nuclear forces? We've been hearing about these 300 and some missile silos with the expectation that each of them might have a 10 warhead intercontinental range missile installed in them in due course. This would be a very, very dramatic buildup indeed of the Chinese military capabilities, especially in the nuclear space, would it not?
Well, certainly. And whether or not all 345 or so of those silos are filled, even if some are just decoys, we know that China is rapidly building up its nuclear arsenal faster, perhaps, than we have seen any country do this in
Mm,
history.
agreed.
The issues here are a number of them, including China's failure to be transparent about this, because both Russia and the United States publicly declare their operational warheads. And also, China's refusal to engage with any other country in arms control discussions. Those also are critical. But the thing that I find that something that we can control is modernizing our triad. All three legs of that are outdated. And although there are some modernization efforts underway, they are inadequate compared to not only the Chinese, but also the Russian arsenals. So
Mm.
this really is an issue for the United
To say
States.
nothing of the combination of the two, which is
To say
now
nothing of the
in prospect.
combination of the two, and we have to be
Yeah.
concerned that they will fight together because they have been, since 2005, drilling their militaries together. The pace
Mm.
of those exercises between China and Russia have increased recently, as well as the scope of what they are doing. So this is, we have to assume that they are both going to support each other, as we see, for instance, with China's support for Ukraine. We could see even more direct support from Russia on a Chinese incursion or invasion of some sort along its periphery.
Yeah. And I think the fact that among those exercises are simulated thermonuclear attacks against this country is the sort of thing that ought to be very much concentrating our mind. Gordon, very quickly, and lastly, the administration has announced that it intends to use the Defense Production Act to build out our own capacity to produce solar power arrays. The It's simultaneously, amazingly, it's saying to the Chinese, we're going to remove tariffs on their imports of these things. Does this make any sense at all to you?
Not much. On balance, this is a huge win for China because the waiver of the tariffs on solar panels for 24 months basically devastates American industry.
Yeah.
As a friend of mine who's in the industry says, this really is a dog whistle to American companies across the board, not just solar panels, that the Biden administration will do nothing to help them to
Mm.
move their production off of Chinese soil. So basically, it stopped American companies from moving their supply chains here. It also, by the way, undercut American law by interfering in this Commerce Department investigation. So
Yeah.
this is a real win for China.
A win for China, a loss for the United States. It seems to be the leitmotif of this administration. Gordon Chang, thank you for your time today, my friend. Come back to us again with updates soon if you would. Ken Timmerman is next. We'll talk to him about the show trials right after this.